Imagine you're trapped inside a metal tube, 200 feet beneath the Caribbean Sea. The temperature has climbed past 120 degrees. The air is heavy with diesel fumes and carbon dioxide. Sweat runs into your eyes. All around you, sailors lean against the walls, dizzy from heat and exhaustion. You've been submerged for days. There's no fresh air, no sunlight, no contact with the outside world. The radio has been silent. Then, the hull shudders. A dull explosion rolls through the steel. Another follows. It's October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you're aboard a Soviet submarine somewhere beneath the Caribbean. Above you, the US Navy is dropping depth charges, small, non-lethal explosive devices meant to force submarines to surface. But from inside the submarine, you don't know that. All you know is that something is detonating overhead. And for nearly 2 weeks, the United States and the Soviet Union have been locked in a nuclear standoff. In this moment, you have to decide how to respond. In your forward torpedo bay, a 10-kiloton nuclear warhead sits inside one of the submarine's launch tubes. If you give the order to launch, the nuclear torpedo will destroy the American warships hunting you above. But it would also be seen as a nuclear strike against the United States. Retaliation would be immediate. Welcome to Not Your Average History, where the stories your textbook skipped finally get told. To understand how it came to this, we have to go back 13 days, when American reconnaissance planes first photographed Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. The Soviet Union had secretly placed the weapons there to protect its ally Cuba from another US invasion, and to bring nuclear missiles within striking distance of the United States. In response, President John F. Kennedy announced a naval quarantine around Cuba, a blockade in everything but name. You see, calling it a blockade would have meant war. So instead, American warships formed a perimeter and warned Soviet vessels they would be stopped if they tried to reach the island. Soviet surface ships slowed. Some retreated. But beneath the surface, 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class submarines were already en route, deployed before the quarantine was announced, carrying nuclear torpedoes and operating in total secrecy. Their mission was simple: reach Cuban waters and be ready if the United States tried to invade. But there was one problem. These submarines were diesel-electric, built for colder northern waters. A design that worked in the Arctic but struggled in the heat of the Caribbean. They needed to surface regularly to recharge their batteries and bring fresh air into the vessel. Under normal conditions, that was routine. Under a naval quarantine enforced by American destroyers, it was dangerous. So B-59 stayed submerged, longer than planned, deeper than intended, hotter than it was ever meant to endure. By the time American destroyers located them, the submarine was already strained to its limits. Days of heat, exhaustion, and stale air had pushed the crew to the edge. Men were dizzy, tempers were short, clear thinking was becoming harder by the hour. When the first depth charges detonated nearby, there was no way to know they were warnings. Inside B-59, the responsibility for what happened next fell to 3 men. On most Soviet submarines, 2 officers could authorize the launch of a nuclear weapon. On B-59, it required all 3. To Captain Valentin Savitsky, the conclusion was obvious. He felt that the explosions could only mean one thing: the Americans were attacking. And if that was true, then the crisis had already crossed into war. His position was clear. He voted to prepare the nuclear torpedo. Next was Ivan Maslenikov, the political officer responsible for representing Moscow's interests aboard the submarine, and he agreed. 2 authorizations were in place. Only one man had not yet spoken: Vasili Arkhipov. He was not just another officer on board. He was the flotilla commander, senior in rank and required to authorize any nuclear launch. A year earlier, he had served aboard the submarine K-19 when its nuclear reactor nearly melted down. He had watched men die of radiation poisoning to save the ship. He understood what nuclear escalation actually meant, and he was not convinced this was war. In the suffocating control room, 3 officers argued over the fate of the world. Savitsky insisted the Americans were attacking. Maslenikov backed him. Arkhipov disagreed. If the United States had intended to destroy them, he argued, they would already be gone. The explosions were measured, deliberate. not the chaos of open warfare. Savitsky wasn't convinced. The submarine shuddered again as another detonation rolled through the hull. Arkhipov did not move. Without his authorization, the torpedo could not launch. Seconds stretched. Another explosion. Steel groaned around them. They faced a choice: fire blindly into what he believed was war, or surface and risk whatever waited above. Savitsky and Maslenikov relented, and the order was finally given to surface. The ballast tanks flooded. Compressed air roared through the hull. Slowly, B-59 began to rise. Every meter upward carried its own risk. If Arkhipov had been wrong, the American ships above might already be preparing to fire. The submarine breached the surface of the Caribbean Sea. Hatches opened. Fresh air rushed in. Above them were the American destroyers, close, armed, watching. But there were no missiles in the sky, no mushroom clouds on the horizon, no war. The depth charges had, in fact, been warnings. The nuclear torpedo remained unfired, and the crisis did not escalate into nuclear war. In the days that followed, negotiations moved forward. The Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba. The United States agreed to remove missiles from Turkey. The standoff ended. When B-59 returned home, there were no medals, no public acknowledgement. The Soviet High Command was actually embarrassed that the submarine had surfaced. One admiral reportedly told the crew it would have been better if they had gone down with the ship. For decades, the standoff aboard B-59 remained classified. The world moved forward. People went to work. Children went to school. Cities grew. No one knew that the fate of the world had come down to a single argument inside a suffocating steel hull beneath the Caribbean Sea. Vasili Arkhipov died in 1998. Most people have never heard his name. They never learned that two officers were ready to launch a nuclear torpedo. But one man refused, and that's why you're here.